Hiya folks, and welcome back to the workshop. As promised, loads of people have been asking for a tour of my assembly bench. You see, when I first built this workshop almost 6 years ago, I started off by making benches that were designed to be fixed to the walls. But on the far side of my shop, I didn't have a wall. It was just an open garage, so I needed some sort of bench that I could easily move around. So I just modified one of my wall benches and put wheels on it. I didn't know at the time it was going to become my most used bench in the shop. I thought I'd share with you just a bit of information about kind of how it's put together and a couple of the features that I've incorporated into it. And if I was building another version, what I would change about it, and I'll cover more about that later on. So, this is my trusty assembly bench. I'll tell you the dimensions of it first of all, because that might be a handy thing for you to know. It is 790 wide and 1800 long. The width of it is designed literally so I can get it out of my workshop door. So it's about as wide as I can possibly make it, because occasionally I've got projects that I build that are really heavy, and if I can make it on the bench, then I can wheel the whole assembly bench out to my truck and just slide whatever I've made off my assembly bench and into the back of my truck. Oh, and by the way, I made the height of it exactly the same height as the tailgate of my truck, so I can literally just slide stuff off and into the back. Obviously the whole thing is on wheels, just on 4 wheels, but they're quite heavy duty rubber casters. All of the casters have brakes on them, but to be honest, it's so heavy, the assembly bench anyway, I very rarely need to use the brakes. I'll just move these cloths out the road. The whole thing is kind of based on 4 different levels. So we've got a level at the bottom here where stuff goes kind of across the assembly bench. So this is anything up to about 800 wide. Anything wider than that, you'd probably end up tripping over it. But you can get fairly wide stuff right across the assembly bench. And then up onto this level, level 2, I've got all the longer stuff. So I've got things like skirting boards, bigger trim pieces, just big bits of wood that I need to keep nice and straight and flat really. And then up to level 3 here, I've got all of my trim mouldings, and they're in these little pipes along the top section. I'll show you those in a second. And then obviously we've got the main work surface of the assembly bench itself, which of course has my flip top lid for the router table, which I'll show you later on. I'll start at the bottom and kind of work up. So you can see the construction and joinery. Well, there is no joinery really, it's all just screwed together. There's nothing particularly fancy about it. A lot of the stuff on this ended up getting kind of retrofitted later down the line, and I've added quite a few bits onto it over the years. I've actually come up with a new version 2 plan of an assembly bench. If I was going to make a new one from scratch, I've come up with a few design ideas that would be a bit of an improvement on this. I'll include a link in the description below, so if that's of any interest and you're planning on making one, then that might be useful for you. So 75mm rubber casters on the bottom. As I say, they've all got the brakes on them, but very rarely use them. We've then just got standard 2x3 stud timbers making up the main kind of framework. A big horizontal piece that runs all the way along both sides. That's got a sheet of 18mm ply on top, and that basically forms the lower shelf. Over on the left here is just where I keep kind of smaller boards. In this middle section here, I've got a bunch of like mahogany there. I've got like beech, more mahogany. A lot of offcuts of this stud timber. That can be really handy if I'm making a project and I just need a few bits of wood to kind of support the project that I'm making, or I very rarely use these to build anything. It's more used to just lift stuff off the assembly bench, maybe when I'm painting it. And then over at the end here, more offcuts of hardwoods and whatnot, and then a big stack of, it tends to be more MDF over on this side, so 6mm, 18mm offcuts of MDF. And they all go the full width of the assembly bench. So as I say, anything up to about 800mm can sit in this bottom section. On to level 2, we've got all of my longer strip woods. And this tends to be kind of thicker materials. You know, there's old architraves there, some skirting material, all sorts of different profiles. It just tends to be stuff that's left over from projects that, you know, what do you do with it? In all honesty, a lot of it just gets cut up and goes on the barbecue, but it is handy to keep a lot of this stuff. All of these ones with the little pen mark on the end, that is all my 20mm framing that I use for floating shelves. But again, I get through so much of that I tend to just cut it up as I need it. Sometimes I do get round to preparing a bit of a stock, but it disappears so quickly. This section is held in place, by the way, by just these bits of ply that go right across, and you'll see I've got, I think, 4 of those all in. So one there, another one there, and one at the end. And that just keeps everything on that level nice and straight and flat. And then you can also see similar supports that I've put in for the top section as well. And then, of course, on the 3rd level up here, we have my stock, where it's not really a stock, it's just offcuts of mouldings, like trim mouldings and whatnot. And they're all running down these square guttering downpipes here. And these are all just kind of screwed in place. They're screwed from the underside into this bit of wood here. And they're also glued together as well. They're not going anywhere. I mean, I tend to buy mouldings as I need them. Mouldings can be quite expensive, so I try not to end up with a giant leftover stock of mouldings. But at the same time, it is really handy to have, you know, got quarter rounds, smaller quarter rounds. I've just got like little, tiny little bead mouldings there. I've got bigger mouldings there. Tiny little offcuts of softwoods and whatnot. Again, they can be quite handy for running one moulding against another if you want to just make something look wider than it really is. For example, you could get, show you on a shorter piece. So for example, you could get a moulding like that and then run that up against it. And by the time it's all painted and everything, you'd never know that that's 2 separate pieces of wood, but it can just help to beef it out a little bit. Or you can even, sometimes you might want to do something where you run it on that side for whatever reason. It just gives you a bit of flexibility for different options. So having tiny little strips like that is quite handy. Nothing goes to waste. And then at the top level, I've got a clamping edge on this edge and on that edge, and it just allows me, if I'm needing to clamp something onto the bench, I can easily get a clamp under there. When I originally made this, I didn't think I would need a clamping edge on this front edge, but as it is, I do regret not having an overhang on this front edge as well. There's been a few situations where it would be really handy to be able to clamp stuff on that side, and you end up kind of trying to put clamps into the tubes here and all sorts of things like that, which isn't ideal. If I'd just made this a little bit longer, it would have been a bit better. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. And then, of course, I've got hooks all the way under here, which is really handy. This is my main spanner for my router, for on the router table, which I just keep on there, which just keep things to hand. A couple of cloths are always handy as well. You can never have too many hooks. And then, of course, over on the other side, I've got my NVR. And I've made a video all about the NVR. I'll include a link in the description below. But it's basically just a 4-gang that goes into an NVR that's a no volt release switch. So I've got a proper emergency stop button for my router. And then this end I can just plug in to the nearest socket. So that's just a way of electrifying my bench and getting power to these sockets here. The big benefit of having an NVR is that if there's ever a problem in the workshop and I lose power for whatever reason, then if power comes back on, then my router table doesn't suddenly start up all by itself, because that's, I'll include a link in the description to the video where I talk about what an NVR is. And then, of course, at the top here, I have my flip top lid for the router table. Wanna move my feet, wanna jump on one. Wanna move my feet, wanna jump on one. Wanna move my feet. Generally, I just screw this to the bench when I'm using it. I mean, it's pretty heavy, it's not going anywhere. I did design it with these clamping edges on so that I could just clamp it to the bench if I needed to, but in all honesty, I've never used them and I've always just screwed the router table to the bench and it's been fine. The reason obviously for the flip top lid on the assembly table is because if it wasn't for that, I'd end up having to have this much higher up to compensate for the depth of the router. The Triton router is quite a beast of a router and it goes quite deep into the assembly bench itself all the way down here. But I've got plenty access for getting in to adjust the height, so I can do the main kind of rough adjustment there and I can get into the fine adjuster here as well. So it's easy access. The only thing that's a little bit tricky to access, I mentioned it on the video that I did about the router table, is getting to the speed controller is kind of all the way around the back of the Triton, but it's fine, you get used to it. But other than that, this has worked amazingly well. It's just worked absolutely brilliantly. I've got a whiteboard strip on the front here so that I can scribble measurements onto here if I just need to quickly remember something while I'm working. I've also got a whiteboard strip at the back here and some hidden whiteboard strips at the back of the router table as well. I'm not going to talk about the router table itself too much. I will include a link in the description below where I do natter on about this in a bit more detail. I haven't done any plans for this yet. I will when I get some time. I'll put some proper plans together and I'll pop them onto my shop, and if you're interested in making one of these you can, or you can just work it out for yourself. Really not that complicated. It's just a box and a bit. So on the whole, I've been really happy with this assembly bench the way I originally made it. If I was going to make it again, there's a few things that I would change. First of all, as I say, I would have a clamping strip on both the front and the back. Another thing is I've had a little bit of sag towards the middle of the bench. And I mean, to be fair, this is really heavy, this bench. And it's only put together with like thin stud timbers. So what I would do is I would run a bit of a beefier piece of wood along this main horizontal strip along the bottom here, and I would also add in an extra set of wheels in the middle, so I would have 6 wheels instead of 4 wheels, and then that'll just stop any inclination of it to kind of sag. It hasn't sagged by much, but let me check. I reckon it's sagged by about under 5mm. I would say about 4mm it's sagged. Where's my spacers? The blue one, 3. Oh, there's not a lot in it though. Not even. I would say it's probably closer to 3mm. So it's not a lot of sag, but it's a problem if you're trying to make something perfectly flat. You really want your assembly bench to be perfectly flat. And then the only other quite major thing that I would change is that I would ditch the flip top lid and I would turn the entire top into an MFT, table with holes in. I think I would benefit more from having an MFT top than I would from the router table, and I'd just have to find somewhere else to put the router table or live with it being a bit higher up and not delving into the actual thing itself, but it would have to be a lot higher. At the moment I'm losing about 140mm of height because of the router box. I would live with the router table being 140mm higher. It wouldn't really matter that much, and for the benefits that an MFT would give us, it would really be worthwhile. That would be my dream assembly bench. Basically exactly what I've got now. MFT on the top, 6 wheels, extra bracing or supporting to stop it from sagging in the middle. And other than that, I wouldn't really change anything else about it. It's been awesome. As I say, I have put quite detailed plans together of my version 2 assembly bench. I will guarantee that you will end up building it before I build it. but it is on my to-do list to upgrade this assembly bench. It might be easier to just build a brand new one from scratch, but if you do manage to build one before me, it would be awesome if you post a few pictures on Twitter and tag me in it, Gosforth Andy on Twitter. Again, if you've come up with your own assembly bench design, post a few pictures on Twitter and tag me in, because I think it's dead interesting looking at stuff like this. Thanks again for watching. I shall see you next time. Bye!